A man walks into a small-town home, claiming he's there to protect the community. Hours later, 3 lives are erased, including a child's. When confronted, he calmly says, "I just wanted to test myself." What kind of mind believes murder can prove virtue? Part 1. Blood on the floor. The scene of horror. Blood smeared across the linoleum floor. A child's toy car, tipped on its side, glistened under the dim overhead light, streaked with red. Near the bedroom doorway, faint drag marks suggested a desperate attempt to flee. No voices remained in the house, only the metallic scent of blood hanging thick in the air. In the adjacent room, the lifeless body of 10-year-old Jesse Ryan lay crumpled, eyes open in frozen terror. Small hands clawed at the worn carpet. The violence displayed within this modest mobile home in Amity, Maine, was neither spontaneous nor frenzied in nature. It was calculated. The positioning of the bodies, the sequence of events later reconstructed from forensic evidence, and the incomplete efforts to obscure the crime indicated the work of a single offender with clear, deliberate intent. The absence of forced entry or signs of initial struggle suggested that the killer had been willingly admitted. This detail alone pointed to an existing familiarity with the victims, or, at minimum, a capacity to manipulate social dynamics to gain entry. In the small storage shed behind the house, investigators discovered the second victim, Jeff Ryan, the father of Jesse. His wounds were extensive, concentrated on the torso and back. The pattern of injuries aligned with an ambush scenario, where the victim was caught off guard, leaving little opportunity for defensive action. Blood spray analysis on the interior walls of the shed corroborated this, showing no evidence of a prolonged struggle. The body placement indicated a purposeful concealment attempt, though hastily executed. Near the edge of the gravel driveway, the third victim, Jason DeHaan, lay face down, mutilated. The trail of blood leading to his body suggested that he had attempted to escape the residence, only to be overtaken and finished outdoors. The offender's willingness to pursue a fleeing victim beyond the confines of the initial crime scene revealed an escalating drive to exert total control over the situation. This escalation is diagnostically significant, as it marks the transition from a targeted killing to a compulsion-driven act of domination and eradication of witnesses. At the core of this offender's psychological profile lay a distorted sense of moral justification. Early behavioral hypotheses pointed toward elements of narcissistic vigilantism. The nature of the attacks, premeditated, methodical, and devoid of personal rage, suggested the offender perceived himself as executing a form of justice rather than acting from impulsive anger. However, the decision to kill Jesse Ryan, an innocent child, sharply contradicted any rationalized moral framework. This inconsistency implied deeper psychopathology, an impaired capacity for empathy, and a disconnection from the consequences of violence inflicted on vulnerable individuals. Forensic analysis revealed partial attempts at forensic countermeasures. The victim's vehicle had been driven 15 miles from the scene and set ablaze. Items within the house were repositioned, but no systematic cleaning occurred. Cigarette butts and beer bottles, later yielding critical DNA evidence, remained at the scene. These incomplete efforts pointed to a perpetrator lacking in practical criminal experience, yet exhibiting a cognitive overconfidence characteristic of individuals with grandiose self-concepts. Witness interviews soon narrowed investigative focus onto a single name, Thane Ormsby, a young man with tenuous connections to the victims, known to have been residing with acquaintances nearby. His behavioral patterns, personal history, and recent movements aligned with both the logistical and psychological demands of the crime. What remained uncertain, however, was the precise trigger. What internal shift had driven this offender from contemplation to brutal action? And why had the carefully constructed persona of moral enforcer crumbled so completely in the face of innocent life? These questions would soon guide the next phase of the investigation. Part 2. A Town in Fear. The Hunt for a Killer. News of the killings spread quickly through Amity. A town long accustomed to predictable routine was now gripped by collective fear. The brutality of the crime, paired with the unknown whereabouts of the perpetrator, created an atmosphere of escalating suspicion. For law enforcement, the priority was containment. Roadblocks were established, residents interviewed, and patrols increased. Despite these efforts, anxiety remained high. In a community this small, the absence of an obvious suspect heightened the psychological tension. Initial analysis of the crime scene suggested that the offender had familiarity with both the victims and their living environment. The selective targeting of Jeff Ryan, followed by pursuit and execution of Jason DeHaan and Jesse Ryan, indicated personal engagement rather than random opportunism. Yet, no credible threats against the victims had been previously reported. This disconnect prompted investigators to consider alternative motivational structures, including ideological or delusional beliefs driving the offender. Behavioral analysis teams hypothesized the presence of an offender who viewed himself as acting under a self-ascribed moral directive. The methodical nature of the homicides, coupled with incomplete efforts to obscure forensic evidence, suggested cognitive planning coexisting with emotional impulsivity. This psychological profile aligned with individuals exhibiting traits of narcissistic personality disorder, possibly combined with antisocial tendencies. Forensic evidence provided a breakthrough. DNA retrieved from a beer bottle and cigarette butts at the scene matched Thane Ormsby, a young man known to have recently resided with a local family connected to the victims. Ormsby's presence in the town during the time of the murders, followed by his abrupt relocation across state lines, elevated him to primary suspect status. Law enforcement coordinated with New Hampshire authorities to locate and interview Ormsby. His initial interactions with investigators displayed hallmarks of controlled affect, strategic self-presentation, and selective disclosure. These behaviors were consistent with offenders attempting to maintain a facade of innocence while navigating investigative inquiry. His willingness to provide DNA and fingerprints, likely perceived as a demonstration of confidence, ultimately reinforced the forensic linkage to the crime scene. From a criminological perspective, Ormsby's decision to remain socially connected to individuals close to the victims post-crime was a critical behavioral indicator. It suggested a degree of cognitive distortion regarding the risk of detection, further pointing to narcissistic overconfidence. Additionally, his relocation to a known associate's residence indicated a need for perceived safety rather than true evasion, revealing limitations in his operational planning. The investigative focus now shifted toward obtaining a comprehensive confession. The challenge was clear. Ormsby's constructed narrative, rooted in self-aggrandizing delusion, would require careful deconstruction. His internal justification for the killings remained opaque. Without clear insight into this motivational core, the full scope of his criminal intent could not yet be conclusively determined. Part 3. Cracks in the mask, breaking the suspect. Interrogators initiated their session with Thane Ormsby under carefully controlled conditions. The strategy employed emphasized rapport building and non-confrontational questioning in the opening phase. Observationally, Ormsby presented as calm, composed, and superficially cooperative. His speech patterns were deliberate, with a tendency toward verbose self-reference. Such behavior is frequently associated with narcissistic traits, where offenders seek to assert intellectual or moral superiority within the interview dynamic. As dialogue progressed, Ormsby introduced thematic elements suggesting a vigilante motive. He alluded to perceptions of moral decay within the community and positioned himself as an agent of correction. This construct served a dual function. It provided the offender with a cognitively palatable justification for the homicides while attempting to elicit understanding or even sympathy from investigators. However, these statements lacked alignment with the empirical realities of the crime scene, which displayed evidence of escalating violence and a clear disregard for unintended victims. When confronted with forensic evidence linking him to the scene, Ormsby's behavioral responses shifted subtly. Increased physical self-soothing gestures were observed: hand rubbing, facial touching, and occasional averted gaze. These markers indicated rising autonomic arousal, consistent with cognitive stress. Verbally, his narrative began to exhibit inconsistencies, particularly regarding the timeline of his presence at the victim's residence. The emergence of such contradictions is a common inflection point in structured interrogations, signaling the onset of cognitive dissonance within the offender. Interrogators employed incremental confrontation techniques, gradually narrowing the scope of questioning while integrating evidence-based challenges. Ormsby responded with partial admissions, acknowledging non-criminal contact with the victims in an attempt to reconcile his earlier denials with the incontrovertible forensic findings. Notably, he maintained a compartmentalized approach, addressing each evidentiary element in isolation rather than constructing a cohesive alternative account. This fragmentation is indicative of an offender managing escalating cognitive load while attempting to preserve elements of his constructed self-image. As the interrogation deepened, Ormsby's verbal content began to reflect a more defensive posture. His previously expansive narratives contracted, with increasing reliance on deflection and ambiguity. Yet, his affect remained largely controlled, suggesting the presence of practiced emotional regulation, a hallmark of individuals exhibiting psychopathic tendencies. The absence of spontaneous emotional congruence when discussing the victims, particularly the child, further supported this assessment. Crucially, when interrogators probed Ormsby's awareness of the consequences of his actions, his responses revealed marked minimization. He consistently framed the homicides as regrettable but necessary, a cognitive distortion aligning with moral disengagement mechanisms. This pattern of rationalization underscored a significant deficit in empathic processing, reinforcing the assessment of antisocial personality structure. The structural integrity of Ormsby's narrative eroded most visibly when questioned regarding the killing of Jesse Ryan. Here, prolonged response latency, fragmented syntax, and nonverbal markers of distress became pronounced. The incongruity between his earlier justification framework and the targeting of a child proved psychologically destabilizing. Such moments are critical in forensic interviews, as they expose fissures in the offender's constructed persona. At this juncture, interrogators were poised to transition from evidentiary confrontation to thematic persuasion, aiming to elicit a full confession. However, key questions remained. Would Ormsby ultimately confront the full scope of his culpability, or retreat further into self-protective distortion? Part 4. Confession of Darkness. The mind of a killer. Under sustained psychological pressure, Thane Ormsby's defensive posture began to fracture. Interrogators, having shifted to a more empathic but persistent approach, subtly reinforced the inevitability of the forensic evidence. The cumulative weight of this confrontation created a fertile psychological environment for disclosure. At this stage, Ormsby initiated a partial confession, offering a narrative that both acknowledged his actions and sought to preserve a moralized self-concept. In his account, Ormsby described entering Jeff Ryan's property with the premeditated intention to kill. His language remained clinical, devoid of emotional resonance. He portrayed the act as necessary, framed within a distorted belief system, wherein Jeff Ryan represented a corrupting influence. This self-assigned moral imperative reflects a classic manifestation of cognitive distortion, wherein an offender reconfigures reality to justify acts of extreme violence. The progression of the killings, as detailed by Ormsby, revealed an escalation from targeted homicide to reactive and compulsive violence. Following the initial attack on Jeff Ryan, Ormsby acknowledged the presence of Jason DeHaan and Jesse Ryan. His decision to pursue and kill both individuals, particularly the child, reflected an emergent loss of behavioral control, driven by a need to eliminate perceived threats to his operational objective. Such escalation is consistent with a transition from instrumental to expressive violence, where the act of killing itself begins to serve an intrinsic psychological function. Behaviorally, Ormsby's recounting of these events was marked by affective flatness. He demonstrated no spontaneous remorse or empathy when discussing the deaths, particularly that of Jesse Ryan. This absence of emotional congruence is diagnostically significant, suggesting profound empathic deficits consistent with psychopathic personality structure. Furthermore, his repeated references to the killings as a test of personal capability underscore a narcissistic drive for self-affirmation through violence. Throughout the confession, Ormsby intermittently inserted rationalizations designed to mitigate perceived culpability. He framed his actions as reactions to a morally decayed environment, a narrative incompatible with the opportunistic and gratuitous nature of the killings. This pattern of minimization and externalization is characteristic of offenders seeking to preserve a coherent self-image, despite incontrovertible evidence of deviant behavior. The confession also revealed operational planning deficiencies. Ormsby acknowledged post-crime actions intended to obscure evidence, yet these efforts were incomplete and poorly executed. Such behavior reflects a cognitive overestimation of personal capability, often observed in individuals with grandiose self-perceptions. His belief in the potential to evade detection, despite leaving substantial forensic evidence, exemplifies this distortion. Notably, when pressed on the specific motivations for killing Jesse Ryan, Ormsby's responses became fragmented and evasive. He offered no coherent moral justification, instead reverting to vague assertions of necessity. This inability to reconcile the murder of an innocent child with his constructed moral framework exposed a core inconsistency within his psychological narrative. Such dissonance is often destabilizing for offenders with narcissistic and psychopathic traits, as it threatens the integrity of their self-concept. By the conclusion of the session, Ormsby had provided a detailed confession encompassing the sequence of events, methods employed, and post-crime actions. Yet, critical questions remained unanswered. What deeper psychological forces had driven him to select this particular moment for action? And to what extent did his confession represent genuine acknowledgement versus a strategic adaptation to overwhelming evidence? Part 5. Justice, Served, Trial, and Legacy of the Crime. During the subsequent legal proceedings, Thane Ormsby's psychological profile became a central point of examination. The defense sought to introduce an insanity plea, arguing that at the time of the killings, he lacked the capacity to fully comprehend the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. Forensic psychological evaluations were conducted to assess this claim. The results demonstrated that while Ormsby exhibited traits of narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, he retained intact cognitive functioning and an awareness of the moral and legal implications of his behavior. Throughout the trial, Ormsby presented with controlled affect. His demeanor was consistent with prior observations, composed, articulate, and at times detached. His testimony echoed earlier narratives, emphasizing distorted justifications for the murders while minimizing personal responsibility. This pattern of self-serving rationalization is a common defensive posture among offenders with similar personality structures. It enables them to preserve a grandiose self-concept while facing undeniable evidence of their culpability. The prosecution effectively dismantled the insanity defense by demonstrating clear evidence of planning, operational intent, and post-crime concealment efforts. These behaviors reflected goal-directed action, incompatible with claims of cognitive incapacity. Furthermore, expert testimony highlighted Ormsby's calculated use of moralized rhetoric, designed to reframe the killings as justified rather than criminal. Ultimately, the jury returned a verdict of criminal responsibility. Ormsby was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crimes and the offender's lack of genuine remorse or rehabilitation potential. From a forensic perspective, this outcome was consistent with the psychological profile established during the investigation and trial. This case provides a clear example of how cognitive distortions, personality pathology, and grandiose self-perception can converge to produce acts of extreme violence. Ormsby's belief in his own moral superiority, coupled with profound empathy deficits, created a dangerous psychological dynamic. His progression from ideation to action underscores the importance of early identification and intervention in individuals exhibiting such traits. In closing, the legacy of this crime extends beyond its immediate victims. It serves as a reminder of the latent potential for violence within individuals who construct self-justifying narratives to mask deviant impulses. For the community of Amity, the pursuit of justice has provided a measure of closure. For the field of forensic psychology, it offers valuable insights into the complex interplay of personality, cognition, and criminal behavior.